The Ottoman Empire does not enter the story through smoke or fire. It enters through silence, through rooms where footsteps are softened by carpets, where oil lamps glow low against stone walls, and where ink dries slowly on paper. Outside, cannons still guard the gates. Flags still ripple above towers. Soldiers still march. From a distance, power appears untouched. This is how empires prefer to be seen. History teaches that collapse begins with defeat on the battlefield, that borders shrink only after armies break. But this story opens with a darker truth. In the Ottoman world, conquest began to arrive without uniforms. Credit moved where cannons could not. Money traveled faster than troops, deeper than siege engines, and with far less resistance. In these quiet rooms, survival was being negotiated. Loans arrived framed as opportunity. Modernization, they promised. Railways to bind distant provinces. Ports to accelerate trade. Salaries to keep the state running. Each agreement carried the language of reform, not surrender. Each signature was presented as temporary, technical, manageable. Just numbers. Just time. Think about that. An empire that once dictated trade routes across continents, now calculating interest schedules. The transformation was subtle enough to seem harmless. After all, empires borrow. States reform. This looked like adaptation, not weakness. Yet something profound was happening beneath the surface, something history often misses because it leaves no ruin behind. The illusion of strength mattered. The Ottoman Empire was not a failed state begging for rescue. It was still feared, still vast, still sovereign in appearance. That is precisely why the shift to credit was so effective. There was no invasion to rally against, no enemy banners on the horizon. Instead, there were contracts, advisors, financial terms written in careful language. Power did not vanish overnight. It was rerouted. The bloodstream of the empire began to flow outward, guided by repayment schedules rather than imperial decree. This was not incompetence. It was not sudden decay. It was a structural change in how power itself was exercised. Imagine standing in one of those chambers. The air smells faintly of wax and ink. Maps hang on the walls, showing land still controlled, borders still intact. On the table sits a document promising relief. Funds to stabilize the treasury. Funds to keep reforms alive. Refuse it and risk immediate crisis. Accept it and buy time. Time is always the most expensive commodity. The choice feels obvious. And so the empire signs. Again and again. Each time, the terms tighten slightly. Each time, leverage shifts quietly, almost politely. No shots fired. No walls breached. Just arithmetic. This is the moment where force begins to lose its monopoly on control. Cannons can seize territory, but they cannot enforce repayment. They cannot stabilize currencies or balance trade deficits. Credit can. Once debt enters the system, it demands priority. Interest does not wait for wars to end. Obligations do not pause for reform. They accumulate. And with accumulation comes influence. The lender gains a voice, then a seat, then oversight. What began as assistance slowly becomes direction. The empire still rules land, but it no longer fully commands its future. The stakes could not have been higher. Control over customs revenue, over taxes collected from millions of people, over trade flowing through some of the most strategic corridors on Earth. These were not abstract numbers. They were the economic foundations of sovereignty. When those foundations are pledged as guarantees, power changes hands without ceremony. Think about how invisible that transfer is. No parade marks it. No treaty announces it as defeat. Yet the outcome is just as real. Decisions once made in the name of the state now require approval elsewhere. The empire continues to function, but its autonomy is thinner, more conditional. This is why the story cannot be reduced to corruption or mismanagement. Those explanations are comforting, because they keep the problem contained. They imply that better leaders or cleaner institutions would have changed everything. But the mechanism at work here is larger. It is systemic. It is about how finance can replace force as a primary instrument control. When money becomes a gatekeeper of survival, sovereignty becomes negotiable, not lost all at once, but leased, renewed, extended under terms set by others. Picture the contradiction. Cannons polished and ready, yet irrelevant to the real struggle. Soldiers trained for battles that no longer decide the outcome. The empire prepares for wars while losing ground in ledgers. This is the asymmetry of the modern age arriving early. Power no longer needs to announce itself loudly. It can operate quietly through procedures and payments, through deadlines and default clauses, through the simple logic that those who control liquidity control options, and those who control options shape outcomes. The Ottoman leadership understood danger. They were not blind, but their tools were outdated for the challenge they faced. Military strength could deter invasion, but it could not erase debt. Administrative reforms could improve efficiency, but they could not reverse unfavorable trade balances overnight. Every solution required capital. And capital came with conditions. Each solution deepened dependence. The trap did not close suddenly. It narrowed gradually until movement itself became difficult. This is where the story sharpens. Because the empire did not collapse in this chapter. It continued. It adapted. It survived. And that survival is precisely what made the system effective. Credit does not need immediate submission. It thrives on endurance. On the long horizon, it rewards patience. As long as the empire remained standing, obligations remained enforceable. As long as revenues flowed, even imperfectly, leverage persisted. Collapse was not the goal. Control was. So the central question emerges clearly now. How do you conquer territory without invading it? How do you extract value without occupation? How do you shape policy without firing a shot? The answer lies in the quiet power of finance, in the ability to define what is possible and what is not, in deciding which reforms can happen and which must wait, in shaping priorities through scarcity. Canons demand obedience through fear. Credit demands compliance through necessity. And necessity is harder to resist. By the end of this chapter, nothing dramatic has happened. No borders have moved. No flags have fallen. That is the point. The empire still stands, still feared, still functioning. Yet its economic bloodstream is no longer entirely its own. It flows through channels shaped elsewhere. The conquest has begun, not with noise, but with numbers. And once that shift takes hold, reversing becomes far more difficult than winning any battle ever was. This is where the story truly starts. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire looked unbreakable. From its great cities to its distant provinces, it ruled land that linked continents and seas. Trade moved through its territory by default. Taxes flowed from farms, workshops, and ports. Armies marched outward, not inward, to rivals. The empire was not a question mark. It was a constant. Even as Europe began to change, to industrialize and reorganize itself around factories and finance, the Ottoman state still appeared vast and formidable. Maps still painted it as a dominant presence. Diplomats still treated it as a power that had to be managed, not dismissed. From the outside, there was no obvious sign of decline. This appearance mattered more than it seemed. Power is not only about what exists, but about what others believe exists. The Ottomans still commanded respect because their structure remained intact. Bureaucracies functioned. Courts ruled. Armies were raised. Ships sailed. When reforms were announced, they sounded modern and confident. New ministries, new legal codes, new infrastructure plans, railways stretching across provinces, ports designed to compete with Europe's busiest harbors. On paper, this was not decay. It was renewal. The empire was not retreating from the modern world. It was stepping into it. Credit played a critical role in sustaining that image. Borrowed money allowed reforms to happen quickly, without forcing painful choices in the present. Taxes did not have to rise sharply. Spending did not have to be cut immediately. The population did not feel an abrupt shock. That is the quiet appeal of credit. It smooths over transitions. It delays consequences. It allows leaders to promise progress without demanding sacrifice. For a time, it worked. Railways were built. Salaries were paid. The machinery of state kept turning. The illusion of strength held, reinforced by visible signs of modernization. But beneath the surface, the arithmetic was changing. The empire's ambitions were expanding faster than its revenues. Maintaining vast territories was expensive. Reforming institutions cost money before it generated returns. Meanwhile, the global economy was shifting. European factories flooded markets with cheaper manufactured goods. Local production struggled to compete. Imports rose. Exports lagged. Precious metals flowed outward to pay the difference. The treasury felt the strain, even as the public face of the empire remained confident. This is how imbalance hides. Not through collapse, but through contradiction. Imagine a palace that still commands awe. Guards stand at the gates. Officials move through halls with authority. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. Yet somewhere deep inside, vaults are growing lighter, not empty, just thinner. Enough to function today, but not enough to guarantee tomorrow. The state still rules territory, but it no longer fully controls its finances. That distinction is subtle but decisive. Territory can be defended with force. Finance cannot. Once the flow of money becomes dependent on external sources, autonomy becomes conditional. The empire's leaders understood that borrowing was not free. They were not naive, but their calculations were shaped by urgency. Reform could not wait. Stability could not be postponed. The risks of inaction felt greater than the risks of debt, and so borrowing became normalized. It was no longer an emergency measure. It became a tool of governance. Budgets assumed future loans. Projects were planned with external capital in mind. This is where the illusion deepened. Credit was no longer a bridge to self-sufficiency. It became part of the foundation. The contradiction grew sharper over time. On maps, the empire still stretched wide. In diplomatic circles, it was still treated as a necessary player. Yet, economically, its margin for error was shrinking. Revenue no longer matched ambition. Every new reform increased operating costs. Every new infrastructure project required maintenance. Meanwhile, trade imbalances persisted. Money left faster than it returned. The state responded not by retreating, but by borrowing again. Each loan stabilized the present while narrowing the future. The system looked stable because it was constantly being reinforced from the outside. This is why the illusion of strength was so convincing. There was no single moment when weakness announced itself. No sudden bankruptcy. No public admission of failure. Instead, there was continuity. The empire continued to function, and functioning states are assumed to be sovereign. But sovereignty is not just about continuity. It is about control. And control was slowly being diluted. Decisions increasingly had to account for creditor expectations. Policies were weighed not only for domestic impact, but for financial reassurance. The center of gravity began to shift. Think about how quiet that shift is. No crowds gathered to protest interest rates. No banners denounced repayment schedules. Yet these forces shape reality more effectively than proclamations. When a state's finances are strained, priorities change. Long-term development gives way to short-term stabilization. Innovation yields to obligation. Flexibility disappears. The empire could still choose its path, but the range of choices was narrowing, like a ship still moving forward, but with fewer degrees of freedom in its course. From the outside, observers often mistook adaptation for strength. Railways signaled progress. Legal reform suggested modernization. New uniforms and institutions projected confidence. But these were symptoms, not cures. They addressed surface inefficiencies while deeper imbalances remained unresolved. Credit allowed this gap to persist. It masked structural weakness by postponing its consequences. That postponement created time, but time came at a cost. Interest accumulated. Obligations stacked. Guarantees expanded. What began as manageable grew heavier with each cycle. The illusion also shaped foreign perceptions. European powers did not see a collapsing empire. They saw a state willing to integrate into the global financial system, a state that honored debts, a state that reformed its laws to accommodate commerce. This made it attractive, not threatening. Influence flowed naturally toward those who provided capital. There was no need for coercion. The system incentivized compliance. As long as the empire met its obligations, it would be supported. Support, however, came with expectations. Inside the empire, the effects were uneven. Urban centers connected to trade benefited more than rural regions. Imported goods reshaped consumption patterns. Local industries faced pressure. Tax systems strained to extract revenue efficiently. These internal tensions did not immediately translate into collapse, but they added friction. The state became more complex to manage, more expensive to sustain, and more dependent on steady financial inflows. Each of these factors reinforced the need for credit. The loop tightened, quietly, predictably. This chapter is not about failure. It is about appearance, about how power can look intact while its foundations shift. The Ottoman Empire did not stumble blindly into weakness. It navigated a changing world using the tools available to it. Credit seemed rational. Reform seemed necessary. Together, they sustained the image of strength. But images can deceive. They can hide slow-motion transformations that only become obvious later, when reversal is no longer possible. By the end of this phase, nothing dramatic has happened. The empire still exists. Its institutions still function. Its authority is still recognized. Yet dependence has grown. The treasury breathes with assistance. The future is pledged incrementally. The illusion of strength remains convincing precisely because it is partially true. The empire is not yet weak, but it is no longer fully independent. And that difference, though invisible to most, will soon define everything that follows. This is the moment before the turning point, when power still looks solid, even as it is being quietly restructured by money rather than force. The cracks did not appear as a single fracture. They spread slowly, almost politely, hidden inside clauses and conditions. At first, each loan looked similar to the last. Funds arrived. Obligations were noted. Payments were scheduled. But loans do not exist in isolation. They accumulate. Interest compounds. Guarantees expand. What begins as assistance slowly reshapes the balance of power. Credit does not demand control immediately. It waits. It embeds itself into the system, then begins to speak through numbers. Every loan carried interest. Interest demanded certainty. Certainty required guarantees. Future revenues were pledged to reassure lenders. Customs duties, specific taxes, monopolies on salt, tobacco, or other essentials. These were not symbolic promises. They were concrete streams of income tied directly to repayment. Once pledged, they can no longer be freely allocated by the state. The empire still collected the money, but it no longer fully decided how it would be used. Think about that. Revenue gathered from the population, yet already spoken for before it reached the treasury. This is where finance became something more than support. It became structure. Miss a payment, and penalties followed. Delay, and confidence weakened. Confidence mattered because confidence determined access to the next loan. And the next loan was always necessary. Budgets were now built on assumptions of continued borrowing. When a state reaches that point, choice narrows dramatically. Repayment becomes priority one. Everything else adapts around it. Education, infrastructure, military spending. Even reform itself must wait its turn behind debt service. European banks did not need soldiers to enforce these terms. The enforcement mechanism was built into the system. Repayment schedules dictated policy more effectively than any occupying force could. If revenues fell short, adjustments were demanded. Spending cuts, new taxes, administrative oversight. Advisors arrived to help ensure efficiency. On paper, this was cooperation. In practice, it was supervision. Autonomy did not disappear, but it was conditional. Decisions were now filtered through financial necessity. The shift was subtle but profound. Trade policy, once driven by strategic interests, had to consider creditor reaction. Currency stability became essential, not for domestic confidence alone, but for foreign assurance. When obligations are denominated in external currencies, internal weakness becomes dangerous. Exports had to grow, imports had to be managed, but structural disadvantages made this difficult. Industrialized economies produced cheaper goods at scale. The empire struggled to compete. Trade deficits persisted. Money flowed outward faster than it returned. Currency pressure followed naturally. When more money leaves and enters, stability weakens. Maintaining value becomes expensive. Reserves thin. Confidence wavers. And confidence, once shaken, is hard to restore. Lenders respond by tightening terms. Interest rises. Guarantees increase. Oversight deepens. Each response makes the system more rigid. This is a lock-in moment. Not a crisis, but a narrowing. The empire still functioned, but its margin for maneuver was shrinking. Administrators tasked with ensuring repayment began to monitor revenue streams directly. This was framed as efficiency, as modernization, better accounting, better collection, better transparency. These are not inherently harmful goals, but context matters. When oversight answers to creditors rather than citizens, priorities shift. The state becomes highly effective at extracting money. It no longer truly controls. Efficiency increases, autonomy declines. The machinery of governance adapts to serve obligation first. Factories lag behind European counterparts. Railways, often funded by external capital, were designed to move goods efficiently to ports, not necessarily to integrate domestic markets. Infrastructure served repayment as much as development. The empire modernized, but along paths shaped by financial logic, rather than strategic independence. This is how credit directs outcomes, without issuing commands. It rewards certain choices and punishes others. Over time, the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Think about the nature of this power. It does not require occupation. It does not require censorship or force. It operates through incentives, through access and denial, through the constant pressure of deadlines. When payment dates approach, priorities clarify. Everything else becomes secondary. Leaders may change. Policies may shift, but obligations remain. Debt outlives administrations. It binds the future to decisions made in the past. This was a turning point. Not a war, not a rebellion, but a system locking itself in. Once revenue streams were pledged, reversing course became nearly impossible without default. Default carried its own consequences. Loss of access to credit, loss of confidence, diplomatic isolation. For an empire dependent on external finance, default was not a reset. It was a threat to survival. And so repayment continued, even as it drained capacity. Leverage transformed into compliance. Compliance reshaped sovereignty. The empire still governed land. Laws were still issued. Courts still ruled. But the economic arteries were monitored from outside. This monitoring did not need to be constant to be effective. The possibility of reaction was enough. Policy was shaped in anticipation. This is how control becomes internalized. The empire adjusted itself to meet expectations, often without explicit instruction. The population felt the effects unevenly. Taxes rose in certain areas. Monopolies affected daily life. Economic pressure traveled downward, even as its source remained distant. Yet the system did not collapse under popular revolt alone. It endured because it was rational, orderly, and incremental. Each adjustment made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a trap. No declaration announced this transformation. No treaty labeled a surrender. That is why it is often missed in simplified histories. But arithmetic does not need drama. It only needs consistency. Once the balance tipped, once obligations outweighed capacity, the path narrowed sharply. Growth could no longer solve the problem quickly. Reform could not outrun interest. The system demanded stability above all else. This chapter is about that realization, about the moment when finance stopped being a tool and became a decisive weapon. Credit transformed from support into control. No invasion, no ultimatum, just numbers aligning in a way that left fewer and fewer alternatives. Once that alignment took hold, there was no easy way back. The empire was still standing, but the terms of its survival were no longer its own. Collapse did not arrive with a single moment of recognition. There was no final cannon blast to announce the end. No dramatic pause where history caught its breath. What arrived instead was exhaustion. The Ottoman state entered the 20th century still standing, still administering territory, still projecting authority, but operating within limits that had been quietly set long before. Wars would come, and they would accelerate the strain, but they did not create it. The outcome had already been shaped by years of financial dependence, by obligations that narrowed options long before armies moved. By this stage, sovereignty had become fragmented, not lost outright, but divided. Control over revenue streams was no longer fully centralized. Certain incomes were already spoken for. Certain policies were already constrained. The state could still govern, but it governed within boundaries it had not drawn. Each crisis now hit harder because flexibility was gone. Emergency spending required approval. Stabilization required reassurance. Reassurance required compliance. The system no longer bent easily. It absorbed pressure until it cracked. When wars erupted, they exposed what finance had already weakened. Military conflict drained resources faster than they could be replaced. Supply lines strained. Revenues fell as disruption spread. Yet obligations did not disappear. Interest still accumulated. Payments still loomed. The empire faced a brutal contradiction: fight to survive politically and risk financial collapse. Prioritize financial stability and weaken military capacity. There was no clean solution. Every choice carried loss. As borders began to fray, the financial architecture remained intact. That is one of the great ironies of the story. Territory could be lost faster than debt. Provinces could break away, but obligations remained attached to the state. Even as authority weakened, repayment expectations persisted. Creditors did not disappear with retreating armies. They adapted. They renegotiated. They positioned themselves to outlast the empire itself. When the final political structure gave way, the economic consequences did not reset. They dispersed. New states emerged from the ruins, inheriting not just land and populations, but financial legacies. Obligations were divided, disputed, and restructured, but they were not erased. The logic of credit survived the empire. Networks of influence adjusted to new borders. The form changed. The function endured. Think about that legacy. An empire defeated less by enemies and by the terms of survival it accepted. The battlefield did not deliver the decisive blow. Arithmetic did. By the time maps were redrawn, sovereignty had already been hollowed out. What remained was administration without autonomy, authority without full control. Collapse, in this sense, was not a sudden fall. It was the final stage of a long process that had begun decades earlier in quiet rooms with signed papers. This is where the story stops feeling distant, because the mechanism did not disappear with the empire. Credit still replaces force. Trade rules still decide winners and losers. Debt still shapes policy more quietly than armies ever could. States today rarely face invasion. They face liquidity crises. They face capital flight. They face conditional assistance. The language has changed, but the structure remains familiar. Modern power rarely announces itself openly. It operates through systems that reward compliance and punish deviation, through access and denial, through confidence and its withdrawal. The Ottoman experience shows how effective this can be, how control can be exercised without occupation, how influence can persist without direct rule. Cannons are loud but temporary. Contracts are quiet but durable. The lesson is not that borrowing is fatal. States borrow all the time. The lesson is about balance and leverage, about who sets the terms, about how quickly short-term survival can trade away long-term autonomy. Once a state becomes dependent on external finance for basic functioning, the center of power shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but decisively. The empire's story also challenges how collapse is remembered. We prefer clean endings, dates, events, battles. But real collapse is often administrative, financial, procedural. It unfolds while institutions still function and officials still work. By the time it becomes visible, reversal is no longer possible. The Ottoman Empire did not wake up one day defeated. It woke up constrained, and remained that way until the structure could no longer hold. This is why the cannons fade from the story. Not because they were unimportant, but because they stopped deciding outcomes. The decisive struggles took place elsewhere, in budgets, in trade balances, in repayment schedules, in confidence. Once those were lost, military strength could only delay, not prevent, the inevitable. The contracts remain the most enduring artifact of this history. Not the walls, not the uniforms. Paper outlasted stone. Obligations outlived authority. And the consequences traveled forward in time, shaping regions long after the empire itself disappeared. That is the true weight of financial power. It does not need to win wars. It only needs to endure. This story is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding mechanisms, about recognizing how modern power operates when it no longer relies on open violence. The Ottoman case is not unique. It is a clear example of a broader pattern, one that repeats whenever money moves faster than accountability, and leverage outruns sovereignty. Empires rise and fall. That is not new. What changes is how. In this case, credit replaced cannons. And once that substitution took hold, history moved quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. If you found this story valuable, subscribe to the channel for more cinematic explorations of hidden power and economic history. And if this perspective changed how you see the past, share it with someone who should see it too.